Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Lars Vågnes. He is the co-founder and CTO of Simile, a AI startup building human-like avatars, and he's currently based in Norway. And previously, he's built multiple different AI startups in China and Norway. So I'm very excited to introduce you, Lars.
Yeah, excited to be here, Liam. Yeah, no, really excited to get to know you a bit better and yeah, have a good conversation.
Lovely. The first question that when I saw your profile on LinkedIn is that you worked in China and Norway as an AI expert. Would love to learn more about like what made you go to China and how you worked in AI startups and then you landed back in Norway.
100%. So if we circle back to the beginning, when I finished high school, I was a little bit unsure about what to do and really tired of school. And Ironically, I found online that if you have a white face, you can go teach English in China and they don't really care, what your credentials are. So I went over there and taught English in a little village for 3 months, and a little village by Chinese standards, which is typically like 1 million people. So so that was a bit of an experience. I was the only foreigner in that city, as far as I knew. And this is like 2013, 14, and I realized kind of, oh wow, this country is awesome. People there are just like really getting after it. The culture is really foreign to me and very interesting. So I wanted to kind of find a way to be there and learn more. And I was always kind of inclined to do engineering and computer science. So I found a program that University of Michigan was doing over in Shanghai, and ended up there. And I think kind of that's sort of how my Chinese story unfolded, and then eventually started a company over there. And yeah, it was a great journey. It's Yeah, so I made a lot of good friends. I was introduced to the Chinese, what do you call it? When people get into college in China, they have to take the college entrance exam. Yeah, so there's a exam Gaokao, right? So it's different from your SATs that you do internationally. It's an entirely different level. And so the people I went to college with, like they basically like one of them, he won the physics competition in his province. 800,000 people he competed with. He won that. And then you have other people like they had to take the college entrance exam and be, like top 100 in order to get in. So top 100 out of like several hundred thousand people. So I did not go through the same filter. I just had to take an SAT because I'm an international student. So it was a little bit of a rude awakening, studying with those guys and realizing kind of how intelligent some people can be. And it was kind of my crowning achievement to become an average student after several years of hardship. But that was great.
Interesting. I saw you were an Imagine AI, right? And the funny thing is, Chris Maiden, he also taught as an English teacher, and there's this weird correlation of other people I interview where they taught English and then they became AI entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I don't know what that. I mean, I guess uh, right now you have this language resurgence, and if you with LLMs and everything, but I don't know I don't know if there's a connection there, but I will say that the appealing thing about this English stuff is just it's really easy to move around. I don't know, not sure what it's like right now, but at least for me, if you are somewhat of a native speaker, you can kind of basically go to any country and you will have a job, right? Pretty much.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And just talking about like English speaking, you are at the interesting part where you're in between like the West and the East, sort of. You grew up in a Western
hmm
country, but you've also worked in the East. What would you say is the differences in like in the way China and Western countries go about AI and startups in general?
Yeah, so I would probably kind of slice it a little bit differently in the sense of Europe and US are definitely different. And then within Europe, there's also differences. But so I grew up abroad, partially in Angola, actually, and then Norway. I went to high school in the US, and then of course China. And so I can speak to a little bit about sort of the sort of superficial differences. I would say for instance, take Norway as an example. In Norway, everything is kind of insulated by the fact that we have so much sovereign wealth money. So people here have a really, really good quality of life, and we don't have a culture in which people really want to get after it. So there is no real urgency in terms of ambition. You can find some places, but it's pretty rare. Um, and I think that is generally true for most of Europe, and Norway might be an extreme. Um, in China, which I mean, it's hard to generalize, but what I will say there is that there is an intense competition, unlike anything anywhere else, because there's just so many people and limited resources in terms of maybe like limited high-paying jobs, things like that. So the amount of competition is insane. Many of my fellow students in this university, they had like white hair, right? And they were like 20, right? So the amount of stress they went through in order to get there, and I'm sure coming from other countries, I'm not very familiar with India, but I think it's probably similar to some extent over there. So that's kind of the uh, kind of meat grinder that these people come through. And so when they come out on the other end, there's an insane amount of resilience built into the people who kind of come out of that successfully. It does leave a lot of people behind though, so it does have a downside. Um, in the US, I would say I think that the biggest difference is just the level of ambition and how big people think. And then you have kind of a good work ethic, maybe not as crazy as in China, but still kind of good work ethic and just this sort of dreaming really big and the insane amount of uh, the insane competence in networking and this culture of paying it forward, which I haven't really found nearly to the same extent anywhere else, where people are just like, hey, let's start having an interaction. You know, what do you do? Oh, you do this. Okay, how can I help you? Right. First time you meet, and then people are having those thoughts, and they'll connect you with whatever. And that's a culture you can't really find anywhere else. Maybe not even outside the Bay Area in the U.S. I don't know, but it's that's very unique.
Mm. And you mentioned that it's hard to generalize China. What do you mean by that? Is there like differences in the provinces?
Yeah, I mean it's a massive country, right? And also I wouldn't really presume to understand all the intricacies that well. I do speak some of the language, but I never really got on the inside completely. So I think you would have to talk to someone who like has that lived experience and you know someone who's Chinese. But it's certainly diverse and also because of this sort of stratification of society, right? So the people that I have the most interaction with are very much the elite um, in terms of you know their competence and how they kind of went through this intense selection mechanism to get to where they are.
Hmm. And you specifically that's built startups around Shanghai, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, so I would say the first startup I built was together with my co-founder, my roommate, very kind of cliche approach. That was not an AI startup. We built a language learning platform. And you know, we never really made a huge amount of money, but we got like I think some 10,000 plus dollars of revenue, probably more. I think he has like the actual numbers. Um, but um, but I think what I learned from that was that um, you don't need permission to do anything, which I think was a really important lesson. And I learned it maybe somewhat late, but especially in Europe, I think there is very much this sort of um, some path has been charted for you, or you try to stick within, you know, some kind of conformity. This is a tendency in every society, but I think it's more common in Europe. And so, kind of having that experience of actually we built a company. I onboarded 100 different language teachers, and we actually, you know, we have transactions. Like we built something here, and no one told me what to do. No one like, you know, that was a very powerful lesson. So I'm grateful that I got that relatively early. And then after that, you know, kind of doubling down a bit on learning more about AI and machine learning, I kind of discovered that while in college doing a self-driving car project, and then kind of, got just completely immersed and fell in love with it. And then after college, I joined a startup as an intern. It was an AI music startup. This is 2018, and essentially what they're doing is sort of generative AI for music before generative AI was a thing. Um, Awesome people there. I became the CTO, co-founder after a while, and long story short, we were too early, which is something that a lot of kind of serial founders can relate to. It's not that the idea is wrong. It's not that the market isn't there. Perhaps it's just that the technology isn't ready for you to actually realize this vision. It is now. So, you see UDO and Suno and all of those guys, and we essentially built a pretty a shittier system given the technical constraints at the time to kind of have a similar experience. So the experience was, something like, hey, I want to listen to a song of, Taylor Swift, Mozart, and Dr. Dre. Make me the song, and it would come out with something that sounded kind of like Taylor Swift, Dr. Dre, and Mozart. It was just the issues, the quality of the sound was just not there, so no one would want to listen to it.
Wow, that's very interesting. I mean, while talking about that culture of like you can't, um, where you're kind of constrained. I live in South Korea at the moment, and it's actually known for first world countries. It's the highest like monopolies. So there's these like five companies which control I think 50% of the GDP.
Is that the like
So
Chebol or what they call
yes,
them?
chaebol.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm.
And the interesting thing is I've been to public school and private school. In public school, all the kids want to go to a chaebol. That's like their only mission. There's nothing else. And
Yeah, tell me about that. Like, how did you get on your journey? Because I'm curious, like how you kind of maybe broke free of that, or yeah.
yeah, yeah, most of my life I wasn't. I mean, I was somewhat interested in startups, but then I felt constrained because it's like, oh, I'm not as like smart as the like maybe Elon or these people who are just savants. But then just going to a private school and transitioning to public school, and then I went back to a private school. There, I accidentally met a friend, and he was like 16, and he said he raised $150,000, and I was like, that makes no sense. That makes no sense. And he somehow did, using some things, but
Yeah, no, it's interesting you should say that. It's like your kind of pivotal moment is interacting with someone who kind of demonstrates it's possible. Uh, it's one of the reasons I think reading biographies is really powerful as well. Like if you don't have access to those people in person, um, if you read a biography of oh, there you go. Yeah, it's just because it just hits different, right? You're just like, oh, this is an actual person, was on Earth, lived, and they did all this stuff, and then um, your understanding of what's possible expands. Doesn't mean you're gonna, become Leonardo da Vinci or whoever, but it's just sort of the realm of possibilities really opens up.
I just got reminded when you're talking about that. Even like historical like greats, like Napoleon Bonaparte, he didn't realize that he was able to become this powerful emperor before he read about Alexander the Great. And there's a story of him actually crying when he realized that Alexander the Great was an actual person and he did all this. And just going back, I saw from a blog post in like China Daily. I had to translate it into English, where it's kind of it's now I'm hopefully this is the correct this. Shanghai, even the whole world of China is full of energy and opportunity. I'm inspired by people here who are doing big projects and I want to be one of them. Could you like share any specific experiences you felt? You already kind of mentioned them of what led you to say this.
Yeah, so I think this was probably 2017, 2018, probably 2018. Um, so it's been a while now, almost 6 years. I will say that um, my point earlier about the people. So it really starts with the people and the people I interact with in China. And of course, it's hard to generalize, but there's just an insane amount of ambition, hard work, and just like genuinely great people. Um, and that's what I can speak to. And so, especially like Shanghai is a city of what, 25 million people or maybe even more. And so you put all those people together. At the time, you have also a pretty big international community. I think that's kind of somewhat It disappeared a little bit now the last years, but that was an incredibly dynamic place that also attracted people that were more willing to take risk because it's not your typical city to move to. Let's say you're living in, I don't know, UK or US or whatever. What attracts you to go over there? Well, you have to be a little bit adventurous. So you have like this collection of foreigners that are quite adventurous, and then there's incredible people, local people there, most of whom may not have like grown up in Shanghai, but have moved there. So that was probably what I was speaking to at the time, and the entrepreneurial energy. Now coming back, I was just in San Francisco for 6 weeks. Just came back, and there's a huge Chinese diaspora over there, right? So a huge diaspora of people who either they come and work in big tech, and then maybe they go start companies, and just the amount of talent and great people there. I've spoken a lot of Chinese while I've been in the U.S. this last 6 weeks, just by interacting with the community, and I can tell you that like that energy is really strong over there as well. Like incredible founders, whether they are kind of just fresh off the boat or whether they have like been there for many years or they are, second generation. It's just like that kind of mentality and culture. And I don't want to be kind of purport to be an expert on this, but that's what I'm experiencing. It's really, really great. Yeah.
Hmm. And what would you say are like kind of misconceptions people have about the tech in China and the people around it that
Yeah, so again, I don't think I can speak to kind of the current situation because even before then I was not as tuned in, but I will say that I think it's just a general thing, like, people to people, and that's the best kind of diplomacy that you can do. And so like actually interacting with people who have that maybe background, you will probably find that some of your presuppositions might be wrong, or you will moderate them. So to me, like for me, it's always just been about the people that I interact with over there, and there's so many great people. I have really good friends that are Chinese, and you know that's kind of where it starts. So like I think if you have those kind of interactions, you will kind of change your mind a bit about certain things. Doesn't mean you'll change your mind about like geopolitics, but you'll probably change your mind about some other uh, yeah, some other things.
hmm, how do you think the rate so so much of China isn't talked about in terms of like AI, how they're developing it. What do you think AI in China, if you can talk about, is state compared to America?
I will give a very sort of superficial view because I'm not so deeply tuned in, but I'm sure I can probably connect you with someone who is more tuned in. But what I would say is what I see and what I hear kind of through the grapevine and through the network that I still have over there is that things are developing really, really fast in China as well. And I think it just went under the radar a couple of days ago. Someone released a model. I don't know who it was, whether it was ByteDance or one of these companies. Um, a model that beats GPT-4 on like a lot of important metrics. And yeah, I don't recall what the model was called, but there's a lot of things that are happening kind of somewhat. The information doesn't flow as quickly into kind of the let's call it the American Twitter sphere or whatever, the Western Twitter sphere. So I think there's definitely a lot of stuff happening that is underreported. I mean, you have, uh, for instance, in our space, you have this. So we build AI avatars, right? So we're hyper focused on like low latency, low cost rendering of essentially a visual representation of an AI. So you can have kind of the interaction like we're having now, like a kind of a Zoom call
Maybe you're
based
an AI.
experience. Yeah, it could be like next year, when we do this, you'll have to have some filters in check, make sure it's not simile running under the hood.
That would be a good
But
marketing trick. Just
for
have an
sure,
entire
for sure.
podcast just made on Simul.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. We're considering like doing some interesting things with that. So hopefully you can release something pretty soon. But yeah, what I was going to say is in China there's a bunch of companies doing this for essentially bringing the dead back to life, right? So you kind of have people who've lost, their son or their spouse or their parent, and they essentially animate them and have kind of deepfake based interaction with their loved one. And I think that's also something that might be quite different from things happening in the West, is that because social norms are a little bit different, um, you might see that certain deployment of technology in certain areas might happen faster because there's just not as the cultural norms are different, and so you will kind of accept things more readily maybe in China, certain areas, versus in the US where the set of things you'll accept are a little bit different. So for instance, this like bringing the dead back to life thing, I think if that was kind of talked about, if we had a product here in Europe, people will probably be pretty skeptical. People are pretty technologically kind of conservative over here. Yeah.
And just so going back to like your startup, how do you pronounce it again? Simil?
Yeah, so it's basically Simly. So it's kind of a play on simulate. But yeah, so I can give you the rundown of what we do. But yeah, essentially, the whole thesis is that human computer interaction started out with the text prompt. So you have, this old computer with where you just have to type in a terminal, right, in order to make it do stuff. And then now we're kind of ending up with TikTok is kind of the most popular human computer interaction, right? Basically, this super stimulating audio visual based experience. And with the ascent of AI, particularly LLMs, you see that we have this new mode of human-computer interaction, which is, basically text-based, chatting to your LLM. But we don't think that's kind of the end all for human-computer interaction because we are inherently visual beings. If you look at our brain, like we're really wired for consuming and processing visual information. So we need our AIs to also have a visual representation. And to do that, you need it. You need to be able to render this really low latency so that you can have interactive back and forth experiences. And you also need it, of course, of a certain visual fidelity and stuff like that. But you also need a really low cost because if you can't have a low cost, then you can't have basically every single interaction you want to be mediated by this kind of visual layer. You won't be able to afford it, right? So think of things like education. All right, we were talking about that before. And I would love to see everyone have, that you want to learn relativity from Einstein. Yeah, go for it, right? You can do that, but you need the cost to be so low that you can almost give it out for free to students around the world. So kind of the good news is that costs are coming down. Compute is being scaled up. There's a huge build out, and the thing about AI is it's exponential. So we have a lot of ways we can really just kind of reduce the costs by 10x and 100x and so on. So.
Hmm. And how would you say, because you're in like the cutting edge, trying to like lower the latency and all these things at the cutting edge of technology, how would you say you go about learning new things and figuring out like what to do when like everything is new? It's never been
Mm,
done before.
yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the hard truth is I've been building this kind of stuff for what is it, 7, 8 years now. So it is like we uh, I don't want to discourage people from like kind of jumping in and tackling really hard problems for sure, and you don't necessarily need all that experience. But it does help in how you think about things. So so that helps me in terms of my mental models being a little bit hardened when it comes to how to think about, well, AI in general and like what constitutes a good model? Should you go for, do you want to build a foundation model for vision or not? Does that make sense? And it doesn't really for what we are doing. You don't want that because foundation models are really, they generalize really well, but they are not very compute efficient in terms of when you want to run inference. So uh, yeah, I think, but again, information is as accessible as ever now. And especially, using ChatGPT or whatever other LLM you use as your kind of study partner, I'm sure you do that when you're trying to learn new things. One of the tricks I do is I just kind of summon a famous expert in this specific domain. So, for instance, if I'm building an AI model and I want someone to help co-pilot my kind of experiments, I might summon like Andrej Karpathy, for instance, and be like, "Hey, you are Andrej Karpathy now, and you're helping me kind of figure out what experiments to run." And surprisingly, like it's a really good tool to help you think about things.
Do you like insert data of Andrej Karpathy's interviews inside?
Yeah, so I do a very vanilla approach. I don't really do it very frequently anymore, but it was an actual thing I did maybe 5 months ago, where I essentially just put that one line, right? And the thing is, it had a pretty big effect on the output. So you could build a RAG system, or a RAG doesn't really apply here, but you could fine tune a model on like I don't know transcripts of Andrej Karpathy's video run-throughs. I'm not sure how useful it would be, um, but uh, but yeah.
Another kind of quote you mentioned, I saw in an interview with Shifter, and this time it was Norwegian to English, which is funny because before it was Chinese to English. Is you said I was under the delusion that it was technical stuff that was more important when talking about one of your previous startups. What was the moment when you realized this fact, and then what do you think is the role for technical founders in the technical part of a company for a successful startup at the moment?
Yeah, so it depends is very contextual, right? So for us right now, like it is very dependent on technical stuff because we are essentially building our own models, and a lot of the value proposition is that our models are faster, better, slower, and a better, faster, better, cheaper, right? So you really need to nail the model stuff, and that is very much like a technical issue, um, technical and research. Now, in the context of that comment, I was probably referring to, I think maybe one like an ed tech thing I did, where essentially this was pre Stable Diffusion, pre all of that. But the idea was essentially, I'm not sure if you're familiar with mnemonics, basically like memory devices. So if you want to remember something, there's a lot of like basically research on making these sort of very visually stimulating tools, and sort of crazy sort of ideas where it's like, I don't know, you make something absurd, you tell an absurd story in order to remember something better. And you have this memory palace is another technique. And I thought that was really cool. I just thought it wasn't as accessible to people. And so I wanted to see if I could build a tool to help students create their own sort of mnemonic devices, essentially like crazy looking visual images, so they can kind of remember a concept, whether it's in history or math or whatever. Um, and I was really obsessed with the technology. So I was basically like building a bunch of like custom AI models to like background removal and like scraping Google, fetching stuff, and like it was a lot of it was an intricate technical system. And I put it in put it in a classroom, and like all the students were like, "What the fuck is this?" Essentially, uh, I mean, they thought it was cool, but it took like 10 minutes or whatever to really create one of those mnemonic devices because you needed to kind of there was some latency, but a lot of these technical constraints. And so in the end, all the energy I spent on optimizing pieces of that puzzle was very much wasted. And I really just should have kind of started more from a user experience perspective and really, try to understand the end user better before I started building a lot. That said, I am a proponent of like building, and it's really hard to really understand if you don't build. At least that's how I'm wired. So you just don't want to spend too much time building something that you could already um, realize is somewhat wasted or is going down the wrong track. So you want to be able to kind of have this sort of build test iteration really tight and make sure that loop is really fast. Um, but I don't think you can really, you know, survey your way to a final answer. So, surveys and kind of user interviews have a lot of benefit, but they are also limited. And especially now where the the cost of building a demo in terms of time or getting something off the ground depends on your product. But generally speaking, that cost has gone down a lot, especially if you already have like the technical competence. So if you can throw something together and it takes you like a day or two, the value of the feedback and learning you will get from demoing something that's actually running versus doing like a mock-up or kind of like just user interviews, I think is vastly superior. So you should kind of look at that trade-off and be like, hey, it does cost me like a day or two to build this thing, maybe it's worth it, right? Maybe let's just build it and then go test it, right? If it's like a month or something, then like it might be a bit different.
So it is a part, but just be strategic about where you use it. And
Mm. Yeah, I think it's very contextual, right? So like if you're building, you're doing something where for us, right, we want to build a model that is superior on these specific metrics. It's, we can't go around doing user interviews, right? The user interviews are pretty straightforward. It's like, hey, we need it to be, lower cost and we need it fast, right? And we need it to look good. And, we kind of already know sort of the technical needs. And then we kind of work within those constraints.
mm, you mentioned about how like building is for you such an important part of learning and not just like surveying. That was something one of the guests I interviewed. He has this massive developer meeting where I think he personally mentored like 100 or more self-taught developers. And the one thing he says is like everyone should like build. Building is the best way to learn. If you don't build, you'll never actually become like a developer who's high level. So I find that interesting connection. I also saw that you got matched up with your co-founders by Antler's program, if I'm correct. How was it like being a part of Antler? And yeah, what was the process like?
Yeah, no, I love Antler. So basically, their whole shtick is like, they find people that are really ambitious and really capable, and they bring them all together, and then they kind of facilitate this sort of matchmaking process in which, they're not really putting their thumb on the scale, but they're essentially creating an environment in which you, as a founder, can find your potential co-founders. And I think the key value proposition there is you will meet people you wouldn't otherwise be able to meet. So that's been really powerful for me and for my co-founder. So I think that's kind of really strong value proposition. And then of course Antler is like a global VC with a huge network, and they've been really helpful for us, in the other issues that we will face as we proceed out of this kind of initial inception stage. So yeah, they've been absolutely great. In terms of what I could tell other founders, like I would definitely recommend like joining an Antler cohort if you're in a situation where typically it's around like you are missing a co-founder, right? And you're really kind of interested in finding someone who can really be a partner in building whatever project it is you want to build. You could also come in without like a clear idea of what it is you want to do. So it's like super, super early, right? And and yeah, and like the network effect and all the people you meet there, like they have a huge community now of like I don't know how many people have gone through it globally, but that's also a big asset. So companies kind of having synergies with other companies that have gone through the same process.
But what would you say are like, because this is something I've kind of struggled with, is trying to find a good co-founder. What are the things you look out for the most? Do you look for trust? Do you look for skills? Or what would you say is the most important aspect of choosing a co-founder?
Hmm. I think definitely you want to obviously you need to find someone who's super capable, and you want to look for compatibility, of course, in terms of like let's say you're building a company and then your friend has a skill set that's very similar to yours, but you just like really like the person, and actually what you need is let's assume you're a technical co-founder and what you need is someone with more of the business savvy, then maybe you shouldn't force it, right? But I think it's all in the end, you really have you have no way of avoiding exercising your own judgment. So there's a lot of rules and a lot of experience that people can impart that have gone through like this process of finding a co-founder. But never forget that it's like you have to exercise your judgment, and no one really knows but you. And then use the morsels of kind of advice and information you can get from people, but still remember that at the end of the day you're making the call. I think another thing is just the grit. It's like what a VC looks for, someone who's trying to kind of found a company. As a founder, you are looking for the same thing in your co-founder, which is do they have the grit, when shit really hits the fan, because it inevitably will. Are they just gonna stick with it? And then I think also just maybe somewhat not spoken of as much, but can you really like have fun with this person? Because you are going to be spending so much time and effort. You're going to be in the trenches together. You want to be able to have fun. Um, so I think that's important as well. Um, so I'm very happy I found that with my co-founder. Um,
One of my guests talking about like being having fun. He said, think of it almost like a marriage. Um,
yeah,
compatibility and stuff, but also the trust and also having fun. Um, yeah, and just talking about grit and stuff, you've built startups, three or more startups before. What makes you keep wanting to be an entrepreneur?
yeah. So it depends on how you define a startup, because as I said, like there are startups, but some of them lasted like a month. We hit revenue, and then for whatever reason decided to shut it down. But I think first of all, I think I just can't really imagine doing something different. So I've worked as like machine learning engineer, data scientist in like big corporations, and I have nothing but good things to say about like the people I interacted with there. But it is like generally speaking, I just want to build something bigger than being kind of a cog in a bigger machine. So that's one thing. And then specifically right now, I just have a vision of what I think the future should be, and it kind of I can't escape that vision. So I have to pursue it. There is no other way. So I can't really picture anything else. Um, I think maybe in some of the previous things I've done, didn't have as much conviction in some of them, but typically I have. Um, but yeah, so I think it's if you build a startup as a lifestyle choice, you're probably not going to do that well. So if it's like if your motivation is I want to build a startup to be cool, you know, when shit really gets hard, you're just gonna bounce. And that's depends on your ambition, right? Because I think building any business is really, really tough. But if you want to build a business that, you want to get to like VC scale and, like take over the world, it's a different game from building maybe like a business that you want to be profitable. And maybe there is a way where you can kind of really hustle for a while and then maybe it doesn't require as much crazy work then, but the people I speak to, even the people who run those kind of businesses, it's still like it is still an intense amount of effort and work. And then maybe when they, become older and successful, then they can rest on their laurels. But I would say that if you think you want to start a startup for like personal growth or kind of because it's cool or whatever. I mean, by all means, go do it, and you'll learn a lot from it. But I'm not sure if shit really hits the fan, how committed are you to like uh, going through with it? I'm not sure, you know.
Yeah, it's like interviewing entrepreneurs. It's like all of the most successful ones I've interviewed, um, they always tell me like this like dark period of their time, and usually after the podcast they tell me more private, and it's like, man, there's no way I could have survived that without like a strong purpose. Um, so yeah. I saw that you also host the AI community like events in
Mm,
Norway. I host one
mm,
myself in Seoul sometimes. I'm just curious
nice.
what are like the insights you've learned about AI and the developers around it from the Norway's event.
Yeah. So the reason I started that, and it's like I guess a year ago, was because AI was really popping off like early 2023. Everyone's like, shit, everything's so over. No point in learning how to code. Like everything's just done. And that was kind of the mentality. Uh, and then sitting by myself, reading all this, living in that world, it felt pretty lonely because. Norway's a pretty small place. The amount of people who kind of understand the shit that's going on is quite limited. And so the whole purpose was to just bring people together so you can have those conversations in person rather than just like, talk to people on Twitter. So or X or whatever they call it now. But I think So that was the motivation, and since then, we've grown quite a bit. Like we have monthly meetups. 100 people turn out like almost every time, and I think what I've learned from the community is there's a lot of latent demand. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to build communities now, and I think people who are much more experienced building communities will say that because of this hyper digital era that we live in, there's this huge demand for in-person connection that is being underserved, and so there is a real opportunity to kind of build communities that are serving that demand. And for us, it's just this specific kind of niche of people who are really, really into AI, and that happen to be in a place where they can't just talk to their neighbor and be like, hey, you saw this new Llama 3 thing, and then people will be like, what are you talking about, right? So it's creating an arena for which they can interact and meet, and been really positively surprised by the caliber of people that are, even in a small place like Oslo. Uh, we had a meetup on Thursday actually, so a couple days ago, and there's one guy was talking about how they're applying diffusion models in order to basically create better images of the sun, so they can model the sun better. So that's kind of his
Wow.
research is like diffusion models for like modeling the sun. Um, and I wouldn't know that those people existed if we hadn't created that community. So yeah, I think build communities just like what you're doing. I'm curious to know what you've learned.
Yeah. I've had three. Two of them were really successful. One, not so, but I learned my lesson from that. But it's basically where there's usually a lecturer, some expert in some form of AI. It's not very technical usually. It's usually people who are like, who do other types of businesses and then they talk about how they've been using AI for themselves. Um,
Mm,
so I found that the people who actually came are like very high caliber people. Like
mm,
some, a lot of PhDs with AIs came and some Series B startup owners came. So it was like the people who are interested, because the specific theme is AI for founders, and I guess
mm,
that appealed to these more high caliber people or people who are very hyper um, knowledgeable about AI. I'm not sure why, but
mm,
I found that there's a lot of really cool people I found from the events. And another thing I like about communities is just, it's because you kind of because usually what happens, at least in my meetups, is usually late. So we have the events, and afterwards, like we just casually just walk and we eat like burger, right? And then you just
mm.
laugh and just joke, and you get to see the real person behind like that cover, which first comes up in a community like event, and especially because it's small, they warm up much faster. So I find that to be like one of the loveliest things about community, kind of figuring out what people are actually like.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you won't get that in a digital thing as much, right? Or at least you would really need to sit down and exert a lot of effort. But when you're in person, it just kind of comes naturally. So yeah, I think a bunch of people have started companies with people they met at our meetup, and some people start collaborating and things like that, which is what is really rewarding about that experience. Yeah.
I firsthand benefited from it because I went to like a developer meeting and like I was just this kid trying to start learning coding. These people gave all their insights, and then I joined a hackathon with a guy who has a PhD
Mm.
in AI and a Silicon Valley like startup owner, and then they just brought me along because of this community. But in like a LinkedIn message, like no one responds to me, or like a Gmail message, no one responds. But actually
Yeah.
physically being there, um, so we have around 12 minutes. So just like okay, so kind of going back to like your startup stuff, I really like this question is what are some of the key lessons you've learned from your past startups that you incorporate regularly into your current startup, Simly?
Mm. Um, I think for me personally, I think one of the big lessons is sort of trust your judgment more. So like you can rely on all kinds of advice from other people, but usually for the problem that you're solving, you're the one who knows the most about it because you're probably pretty deep into whatever it is you're doing, and how, regardless of how impressive an advice or something might be, they don't really know it as intimately as you do. So it's not to say you have all the answers, but typically your opinion matters a lot, right? And really kind of value it like that. I think when I was younger, I mean, I didn't probably place as much emphasis on that as I do now. So I guess that's just kind of comes with experience. I do think, you could build startups where you find some opportunity that you kind of, oh, this is probably pretty cool, and then maybe it makes sense. You can kind of rationalize it makes sense for you to build this company because of, you maybe have the technical competence to do so, or you have the business acumen. But if you really don't love the idea and the problem, at least what I find is that you will kind of lose interest after a while. And maybe you shouldn't play the long game of building a company that's going to take like 5, 10 years plus to build, if that's kind of what you feel. So I built a company like that where I did have some level of course, I had some level of excitement around it, but it wasn't really, really my passion. And, inevitably I kind of burned out a little bit on the idea. And I think that experience was still very valuable. I had to kind of, you have to make some of those mistakes in order to learn. But I would say if you have something that you're truly, truly passionate about, that's a rare thing, and you should just basically just go for that. Even if, uh, yeah, again, my advice is probably shit. You have to contextualize it. But that's what I've learned.
Yeah. So the next question, the last question I asked all my guests, since time's kind of running out, is if you could travel back in time to your own 17-year-old self, what would you tell yourself?
Perhaps I'd say surround yourself with more ambitious people, people that are so ambitious that it intimidates you. Do that quickly. Uh, I think if you do that, um, a lot of things kind of follow. So, and it's not as if you're kind of the most ambitious person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Uh, that's one thing I would say. There's probably a lot of others, but I think I think you probably know this quite intimately, and you're kind of really to your point about like the hackathon or whatever experience that you've had, kind of just getting out and maybe being somewhat intimidated by people you interact with, and like, oh wow, this guy is like running this successful startup, or they're I don't know, like a PhD in AI or whatever it is, right? Just if you surround yourself with more people like that, where you constantly feel like, oh shit, why am I here? Or at least, you initially feel like that, it's a good indication that you're kind of spending your time right, I think.
Hmm. I mean, you also mentioned yourself that while you were in China, you met these people who were like the top of the top caliber, and you were kind of happy to be just average, just because of that. I'm assuming that kind of played a large role in what you're doing right now.
Yeah, so that did certainly that was at least along like the technical dimension, that definitely fit there. And I know also, many of those guys, they are kind of very much multi-talented across different levels. But I think that's kind of generally something I would have told even my 14-year-old self, right? Try to kind of find those type of environments. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. This was Lars Vågnes.